The burgundy velvet rope stretched across the entrance to the VIP bridal suite like a physical manifestation of everything I'd become in my son's life. Unwelcome, inconvenient, something to be managed from a distance. I stood there in my simple, navy dress from Macy's clearance rack, watching through the half-open door as Amanda Richardson twirled in her $8,000 designer gown while her mother Patricia fussed over every crystal bead. The photographer's flash illuminated a scene of perfection that apparently had no room for the groom's mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Excuse me, ma'am? The young coordinator with the clipboard approached me with that practiced smile reserved for people who clearly didn't belong. The family prep area is actually down the hall. The Richardson family has reserved this suite for the bride's immediate party only. My son Kevin appeared behind her, his face flushed with embarrassment. Not the kind that comes from seeing your mother excluded, but the kind that comes from having someone notice the exclusion. Mom, what are you doing here? We talked about this. You're supposed to be getting ready with Tyler's family. We talked about this. As if I'd agreed to be shuffled off to the side room with my younger son and his family. As if I'd willingly accepted being treated like a distant relative rather than the woman who'd raised him for 32 years. I thought I might help Amanda with her dress, I said quietly, though we both knew it was more hope than expectation. I have some experience with wedding preparations. Kevin's laugh was sharp, dismissive. Mom, Amanda has professional stylists. She doesn't need... He paused, glancing around to see who might be listening. Just know your place, okay? This is their day. The Richardsons are handling everything. Know your place. 3 words that hit me like a physical blow, though I kept my face carefully neutral. My place, apparently, was wherever it wouldn't interfere with the Richardson family's vision of perfection. My place was in the shadows, grateful for whatever small role they'd allow me to play in my own son's wedding. I walked away from that velvet rope with the same dignity I'd been practicing for the past 18 months, ever since Kevin announced his engagement to Amanda Richardson. The same quiet acceptance I'd perfected since becoming a widow 3 years ago. The same smile I wore when people assumed that losing my husband meant losing everything else that mattered about who I was. My name is Margaret Thompson, though most people call me Maggie when they call me anything at all. At 67, I've learned that widowhood makes you disappear in ways that have nothing to do with grief and everything to do with how society views women who no longer have husbands to define them. I went from being Mrs. James Thompson, wife of the successful contractor, to simply Maggie, the widow who moved into Sunset Manor apartments and shops with coupons. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It was a gradual fade, like watching a photograph left in sunlight slowly lose its color until you could barely make out the original image. It started the day after James's funeral, when Kevin sat me down with spreadsheets and concerned expressions, ready to manage what he assumed would be my inevitable decline. Mom, we need to talk about your finances, he'd said, using the same tone he employed with difficult clients at his marketing firm. The house is too big for you now. The maintenance costs alone are probably eating up whatever Dad left you. Amanda and I have been looking at some really nice senior communities. Senior communities, places where people my age were expected to gather and discuss their medications while playing modified versions of sports they used to enjoy. Kevin had brochures spread across my kitchen table. Glossy pamphlets featuring silver-haired couples walking hand in hand through landscaped gardens. Everyone smiling as if downsizing their lives was the greatest adventure they'd ever embarked upon. I'd listened to his presentation with the same attention I'd once given to James's construction project proposals, nodding at appropriate moments while calculating numbers that Kevin never thought to ask about. He assumed that without his father's income, I was barely scraping by. He never wondered how we'd afforded Kevin's private school tuition on a contractor's salary, or who had managed our family's investments while James focused on building houses. The truth would have shocked him then, but I wasn't ready to reveal it. I was still testing the waters of my new reality, still learning the rules of widowhood in a world that expected women my age to shrink quietly into whatever corners their children carved out for them. So I sold the house. Not because I needed to, though Kevin never asked about my actual financial situation. He simply assumed that without James, I was struggling to make ends meet. The sale brought in $400,000, which I quietly added to investment accounts that Kevin didn't know existed, accounts that had been growing steadily for 25 years under my careful management, fed by the profits from real estate investments James and I had made together, though only my name appeared on most of the deeds. Kevin found me the apartment at Sunset Manor, a tidy one-bedroom in a complex designed for what the marketing materials called active seniors. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors were quiet, and my son could visit without feeling embarrassed about my living situation. It was perfect for the version of me he needed to believe in, the woman who required his guidance and appreciated his practical solutions to problems I didn't actually have. The apartment came furnished with stories I learned to tell about fixed incomes and careful budgeting. I shopped at discount stores where Kevin might see the bags, complained about rising prices in ways that suggested real hardship rather than mild annoyance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When he took me to lunch, I always ordered the soup and salad special. Always asked for a to-go box for leftovers. Always let him pay the check with that mixture of duty and pity that had replaced whatever spontaneous affection used to exist between us. It became a performance, really. The grateful widow who appreciated her son's concern and guidance. The woman who clipped coupons and drove a 10-year-old Honda instead of the BMW I could have easily afforded. The mother who was slowly becoming invisible, not because of age, but because invisibility was easier than explaining why I'd chosen to hide my actual circumstances from the child I'd raised to value honesty above all else. The performance might have continued indefinitely, if not for Amanda Richardson. Kevin had dated other women over the years, but none who came with such specific expectations about social hierarchies and family dynamics. Amanda wasn't just marrying Kevin. She was marrying into what she perceived as a lower social class, and she intended to manage that transition with the precision of a military operation. The Richardson family owned Richardson Development, the company responsible for half the luxury subdivisions in Maple Heights. They lived in a Georgian mansion on Lakeside Drive with grounds maintained by a team of landscapers and views of Long Island Sound that appeared in architectural magazines. Amanda had grown up attending charity galas and debutante balls, assuming that wealth was hereditary and taste was genetic. When Kevin first brought her to meet me at my apartment, I watched her catalog its deficiencies with the same careful attention I'd once applied to investment prospectuses. The modest furniture from discount stores, the small kitchen with basic appliances, the single bedroom that suggested a life contracted to its essential elements. She smiled politely throughout the visit, but I saw her exchange glances with Kevin, silent conversations about how his family background might affect their social standing. Patricia Richardson made her position clear during our second meeting, when she invited me to lunch at the Willowbrook Country Club. We sat in the members' dining room surrounded by women who wore their wealth like carefully applied makeup, subtle but unmistakable. Patricia ordered wine without consulting the prices, discussed the wedding plans with the casual assumption that money was no object, and spoke about traditions that needed to be maintained for appearance's sake. "We're so excited about the wedding," she said, her smile sharp as crystal. "Of course, we understand that blending families from different backgrounds can be challenging. We want to make sure everyone feels comfortable within their appropriate roles." Appropriate roles? Another way of saying that some people belonged at the head table while others should be grateful for seats in the back row. Patricia was establishing the hierarchy that would govern not just the wedding, but every family gathering that followed. The Richardsons would host, plan, and pay. The Thompsons would attend, appreciate, and stay within whatever boundaries were drawn for them. I nodded and smiled, stirring sugar into coffee I didn't need sweetened, playing the part of the agreeable widow who understood her place in the new family structure. But I was also taking notes, mental calculations about what Patricia valued and what she feared. Knowledge that might prove useful if circumstances ever required me to remind her that appearances could be deceiving. The wedding planning process became an extended lesson in social management. Amanda and Patricia made decisions about venues, menus, and guest lists with the efficiency of generals planning a campaign. Kevin was included in discussions that might affect his comfort, but I was informed of decisions that had already been made on my behalf. I would not be included in the engagement party guest list because it would be too small for extended family. I would not participate in the bridal shower planning because Amanda's sorority sisters were handling those details. I would not give a speech at the rehearsal dinner because the schedule was already full with important family members and close friends. Each exclusion came wrapped in politeness and practical explanations. The engagement party venue couldn't accommodate additional guests. The bridal shower traditions were very specific to Amanda's social group. The rehearsal dinner timeline wouldn't allow for extra speeches without running too late for elderly guests who might need to leave early. Elderly guests. As if being 67 automatically meant I needed special accommodations and earlier bedtimes. As if my age defined my capabilities, rather than simply marking the years I'd survived and succeeded in a world that preferred women to remain young and decorative. The final insult had come 3 weeks before the wedding, during what Patricia called a coordination meeting at her house. I'd been invited to discuss my role in the ceremony, which I'd foolishly assumed meant I would have some input into how my son's wedding would honor our family's traditions alongside the Richardson customs. Instead, I found myself sitting in Patricia's formal living room, surrounded by wedding planners and family members, listening to her explain how the processional would work. Amanda's parents would have positions of honor near the altar. Her grandparents would be seated in the front row on the bride's side. Her siblings would serve as bridesmaids and groomsmen, creating a symmetrical wedding party that photographed beautifully. Kevin would escort me down the aisle and seat me in the third row, behind Amanda's college roommates and sorority sisters. Far enough forward to avoid obvious snubbing, far enough back to ensure I didn't appear in any of the professional photographs that would document the most important moments of the ceremony. "We thought that would be perfect for you," Patricia explained, her voice carrying the same patronizing tone she might use with a child who needed simple concepts explained slowly. "You'll have a lovely view of everything, and you won't have to worry about being part of all the formal posing and family arrangements. Much more relaxing for someone your age." Someone my age. The phrase that had become Patricia's favorite way of diminishing me without appearing directly rude. Someone my age couldn't handle the stress of wedding planning. Someone my age needed simpler meals and earlier schedules. Someone my age should be grateful for whatever inclusion they received, rather than expecting to be treated as an equal participant in their own son's wedding. I'd agreed to the seating arrangement because arguing would have created drama that Kevin would blame me for later. I'd smiled and nodded while Patricia explained how the reception seating would work, with the Thompson family at a table near the back of the ballroom, away from the head table where the wedding party and honored guests would sit. But I'd also made a mental note about Patricia's assumptions and Kevin's willingness to let his mother be marginalized for the sake of social harmony. Information that joined the growing file of observations I'd been collecting about how my family truly saw me when they thought appearances and social status were at stake. The morning of the wedding, I'd dressed carefully in my navy blue dress and modest jewelry, preparing to play the role of grateful mother of the groom one last time. I'd driven to Willowbrook Country Club in my aging Honda, parking in the section designated for general guests rather than family members who raided spots closer to the entrance. I'd walked through the grand lobby with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, past floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent, toward the area where the Thompson family was supposed to gather, while the Richardson family enjoyed the luxury of the VIP bridal suite, and I'd stood at that velvet rope, looking through the doorway at a scene of preparation and excitement that had no place for the woman who'd given birth to the groom, raised him through childhood illnesses and teenage rebellions, and loved him, long before Amanda Richardson ever knew his name. Know your place. Kevin's words echoed in my mind as I walked toward the smaller room where Tyler waited with his wife Sarah and their 8-year-old daughter Sophia. My younger son looked uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo, clearly aware that the family dynamics were more complicated than anyone wanted to acknowledge directly. "Mom," Tyler said when he saw me, his relief obvious. "I was wondering where you were. Sophia's been asking for her grandma." Sophia ran toward me with the kind of unguarded affection that adults learn to measure and modify based on social circumstances. She wrapped her arms around my waist and looked up with bright eyes that hadn't yet learned to see people through the filters of age and economic status. "Grandma Maggie, you look beautiful," she said, and I felt tears threaten for the first time that day. Someone still saw me as beautiful rather than elderly. Someone still ran toward me instead of calculating whether my presence enhanced or diminished their social standing. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, straightening her flower girl dress and trying to ignore the contrast between this modest family preparation area and the luxury suite where Amanda was being pampered by professional stylists and photographed by expensive cameras. Tyler's wife Sarah approached with the careful expression of someone navigating family tension she didn't fully understand. "Maggie, you know we're happy to have you get ready with us, but I have to ask, is everything okay?" Kevin seemed pretty stressed when he was here earlier. Everything was not okay, but explaining that would require revealing truths that I wasn't ready to share. Not yet. Not until I was certain that patience had exhausted its usefulness and that silence had revealed everything I needed to know about who my sons really were when social pressure tested their loyalty. "Just wedding day nerves," I said, applying lipstick in the small mirror that served this secondary preparation area. Everyone wants everything to be perfect. Perfect, the word that had defined this entire wedding planning process. Everything needed to be perfect for the photographers, perfect for the Richardson family's social expectations, perfect for Kevin's career prospects that might benefit from marriage into a family with better connections. Everyone wanted everything to be perfect, except for the people who might wonder why the groom's mother had been relegated to the margins of her own son's wedding. Why the woman who'd raised him was being treated like a distant relative rather than the most important woman in his life before Amanda entered the picture. But perfection, I'd learned over 67 years of living, was often built on foundations that wouldn't bear close examination. And sometimes the people who worked hardest to maintain perfect appearances were the ones with the most to hide when reality finally demanded to be acknowledged. The wedding was scheduled to begin in 2 hours. 2 hours during which I would smile and play my assigned role, accepting whatever scraps of inclusion were offered while watching my son marry into a family that had never bothered to learn who I really was beneath the costume of modest widowhood I'd been wearing for their benefit. But costumes, like all performances, were temporary. And I was beginning to think that 18 months of patient observation had taught me everything I needed to know about what my place really was in this family's hierarchy. Soon, it would be time to show them where I actually belonged. And that place, as it turned out, came with a property deed that would surprise everyone who'd assumed they knew the limits of Maggie Thompson's world. The ceremony began exactly as Patricia Richardson had orchestrated it, a symphony of social precision that left no detail to chance. I walked down the rose-petal-scattered aisle on Kevin's arm, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes evaluating my modest appearance against the opulent backdrop of Willowbrook's garden pavilion. The late afternoon sun filtered through ancient oak trees, casting dappled shadows across faces that represented the peak of Maple Heights society. Kevin deposited me in my assigned seat in the third row with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek, his attention already shifting to the more important participants in his carefully choreographed day. I settled between an elderly woman I didn't recognize and a teenage boy who was clearly more interested in his phone than the proceedings. My position effectively communicating my status as peripheral family rather than honored guest. From my vantage point, I could observe the Richardson family in their positions of prominence. Patricia sat regally in the front row, her emerald silk dress catching the light with every calculated movement. Richard Richardson occupied the seat beside her, his silver hair and expensive suit projecting the kind of understated wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Their relatives filled the prime seating on the bride's side, a carefully curated collection of successful professionals and social leaders who would appear impressive in the photographer's wide shots. The Thompson side looked sparse by comparison. Tyler and Sarah sat in the second row with Sophia between them. My granddaughter's flower girl dress a splash of pink innocence in a sea of sophisticated neutrals. Behind them, a handful of Kevins. Friends from college occupied scattered seats, their presence more obligatory than enthusiastic. My brother Frank had driven up from New Jersey with his wife Dorothy, both of them looking uncomfortable in their department store formal wear among the designer-clad wedding guests. The contrast was intentional, I realized. Patricia had orchestrated the seating to visually reinforce the social hierarchy she'd established throughout the engagement period. The Richardson side represented prosperity, connections, and social standing. The Thompson side represented Kevin's unfortunate but necessary past, now properly contained and marginalized for the comfort of everyone who mattered. Father Miguel Santos began the ceremony with words about love, transcending differences, and families joining together in celebration of unity. His voice carried across the garden with practiced warmth, but I found myself wondering if he understood the irony of his message. This wasn't a joining of families so much as an absorption of one family into another, with the smaller, less prestigious group expected to gratefully accept whatever role they were assigned in the new hierarchy. Amanda looked stunning as she processed down the aisle on her father's arm, her designer gown flowing behind her like liquid pearl. The dress alone probably cost more than I'd spent on clothing in the past 3 years, though the guests wouldn't. Know that my frugal wardrobe was a choice rather than a necessity. She smiled radiantly at Kevin, who waited at the altar with an expression of genuine happiness that reminded me painfully of the boy he'd once been. I'd raised that boy through scraped knees and science fair projects, through the anxiety of high school dating and the stress of college applications. I'd been the one he called when his first business venture failed, when his previous girlfriend broke his heart, when he needed advice about career decisions that would shape his future. But none of that history seemed to matter, now that he was marrying into a family that could offer him social advancement and business connections. The ceremony proceeded with elegant efficiency. Vows were exchanged with appropriate emotion, rings were presented with perfect timing, and traditional promises were made about love and faithfulness until death parted them. I listened to Kevin pledge to honor and cherish Amanda, wondering if those same principles might extend to honoring the mother who'd raised him, or cherishing the relationship that had sustained him long before Amanda entered his life. When Father Santos pronounced them husband and wife, the garden erupted in applause and camera flashes. Kevin kissed his new bride with passion that seemed genuine, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope that marriage might bring out the best in my son, rather than simply confirming what I'd learned about his character during the engagement period. The receiving line formed immediately after the ceremony, another carefully orchestrated element designed to showcase the Richardson family's social prominence. Patricia positioned herself first, greeting each guest with the kind of practiced warmth that politicians employed during campaign season. Richard stood beside her, shaking hands with business associates and social peers who would remember his generosity when future opportunities arose. Kevin and Amanda occupied the center positions, receiving congratulations and well wishes from the carefully curated guest list. I watched from my position at the end of the line as people I didn't recognize offered elaborate praise for the beautiful ceremony and expressed their excitement about the couple's future together. These were Amanda's people, her sorority sisters, and country club friends, her parents' business associates, and social connections. My own position in the receiving line told its own story. I stood at the very end, after Tyler and Sarah, after Amanda's college roommate who'd been designated an honorary family member, after everyone else who mattered in this new social configuration. Guests who'd already navigated the important greetings often bypassed me entirely, their social obligations fulfilled by the time they reached the grandmother-in-law, who clearly occupied the lowest rung of the family hierarchy. Mrs. Whitman, one of Patricia's bridge partners, approached with the kind of polite smile reserved for people she was required to acknowledge but didn't need to impress. "You must be so proud of Kevin," she said, her voice carrying the slight condescension that women of her generation often employed with those they perceived as less fortunate. "I am," I replied simply, though pride seemed insufficient to describe. The complex mixture of emotions I felt watching my son navigate his new social landscape with such apparent ease. "It's wonderful when our children marry well," Mrs. Whitman continued, her meaning clear. Kevin had married above his station, and everyone was expected to acknowledge this social elevation as a triumph worth celebrating, regardless of what it might cost in terms of family loyalty or personal authenticity. I nodded and smiled, playing the role of grateful mother whose son had been elevated by his association with a better family. But I was also making mental notes about the assumptions these people held about my circumstances and Kevin's background. Information that might prove useful if circumstances ever required me to correct their misunderstandings about where Kevin had actually come from and who had made his success possible. The cocktail hour began as guests moved from the garden ceremony to the club's outdoor terrace, where uniformed servers circulated with champagne and elaborate appetizers. I accepted a glass of wine and found a position near the edge of the gathering, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid conversations. That might require me to explain my modest circumstances or my peripheral role in the wedding festivities. The Richardson family held court near the center of the terrace, surrounded by friends and business associates who clearly understood the social significance of this gathering. Patricia orchestrated conversations with the skill of a conductor, managing a complex musical performance, ensuring that important connections were made and social hierarchies were properly acknowledged. Kevin moved through the crowd with newfound confidence, introducing Amanda to his college friends and business associates with obvious pride. But I noticed that he made no effort to integrate the two sides of his family, no attempt to help his Thompson relatives feel included in conversations dominated by Richardson family connections. The separation that had been visually reinforced by the ceremony seating continued during the social hour, with Kevin clearly identifying more with his new family than with the one that had raised him. Tyler approached with Sophia in tow, both of them looking slightly overwhelmed by the social dynamics they were navigating. My younger son had always been more perceptive than Kevin about people's motivations and unspoken tensions. He'd watched the wedding planning process with growing concern, though he'd been careful not to express his reservations directly. "Mom, are you doing okay?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd of well-dressed strangers who were celebrating his brother's wedding. "This is all pretty intense." Intense was one way to describe it. Humiliating might be more accurate, but I wasn't ready to voice that assessment to Tyler, who had his own family to protect and his own relationship with Kevin to consider. My younger son had always been caught between his loyalty to me and his desire to maintain peace within the family, a position that had become increasingly difficult as Kevin's behavior toward me had deteriorated during the engagement period. "I'm fine," I said, squeezing his arm reassuringly. "It's a beautiful wedding. Amanda looks lovely." Sophia tugged at my dress, demanding attention with the directness that children employed when adults were being evasive. "Grandma Maggie, why are you standing over here by yourself? Why aren't you with Uncle Kevin and Aunt Amanda?" Such a simple question from someone too young to understand the complex social dynamics that had relegated me to the margins of my own son's wedding. How Do you explain to an 8-year-old that her uncle had chosen social advancement over family loyalty? That her new aunt's family had established a hierarchy where some people mattered more than others based on their bank accounts and social connections? I'm just giving them space to talk with their friends, I said, which was technically true, even if it didn't capture the full reality of my exclusion from the inner circle of wedding celebration. But you're Kevin's mom, Sophia persisted with the kind of logical thinking that adults often abandoned when social pressures became involved. You should be the most important person here after Amanda. Should be. 2 words that highlighted the gap between what family relationships were supposed to mean and what they actually meant when tested by social pressure and personal ambition. I should be important to Kevin, but I wasn't. I should be included in the inner circle of wedding celebration, but I wasn't. I should be treated with the respect due to the woman who'd raised the groom, but I wasn't. Sometimes things are more complicated than they seem, I told Sophia, though I could see she wasn't satisfied with that explanation. Children had a way of cutting through adult rationalizations to identify the essential unfairness of situations that grown-ups had learned to accept or ignore. The dinner bell chimed, signaling the transition from cocktail hour to the formal reception. Guests began moving toward the ballroom, where Patricia had no doubt arranged seating that would continue to reinforce the social hierarchies she'd established throughout the wedding planning process. I followed the crowd with the resignation of someone who'd learned not to expect surprises from people who'd already demonstrated their priorities. The grand ballroom at Willowbrook Country Club was a testament to understated elegance, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables draped in ivory silk and adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces. Each place setting represented a small fortune in fine china and crystal, the kind of details that would be photographed and remembered as evidence of the Richardson family's commitment to doing things properly. I found my assigned table near the back of the room, far from the head table where Kevin and Amanda would sit with their wedding party and immediate family. My companions for the evening were an eclectic mix of people who'd been grouped together more for convenience than compatibility. Frank and Dorothy sat across from me, their discomfort with the formal atmosphere evident in their careful handling of the multiple forks and wine glasses that accompanied each place setting. Janet Miller, my neighbor from Sunset Manor, occupied the seat to my right. I'd been surprised when Kevin mentioned that he'd invited her, though I suspected the invitation had more to do with filling out the table than acknowledging her importance in my life. Janet was one of the few people who'd remained genuinely friendly during my transition to widowhood, treating me as a peer rather than a charity case who needed management and guidance. "This is quite something," Janet murmured, surveying the opulent ballroom with the kind of appreciation that came from someone who understood the cost of such displays. "Patricia Richardson certainly knows how to throw a party." She did indeed. Every detail had been calculated to impress, from the elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments to the uniformed servers who moved through the room with military precision. This was wealth as performance art, designed to communicate the Richardson family's social standing to everyone present. The remaining seats at our table were filled by Kevin's college friends who'd been deemed too junior for better placement, a couple I didn't recognize who might have been distant Richardson relatives, and Amanda's former college roommate's parents, who looked as uncomfortable with the seating arrangement as I felt. We were the overflow table, the people who needed to be accommodated but didn't rate inclusion in the inner circles of wedding celebration. From my position, I could observe the head table where Kevin sat between Amanda and Patricia, his posture and expression suggesting complete comfort with his elevated social position. He laughed at Richard Richardson's jokes, engaged earnestly in conversation with Amanda's sorority sisters, and made no visible effort to acknowledge the family members who'd been relegated to the back of the room. The sight of my son so thoroughly absorbed into the Richardson family dynamic stirred something deeper than disappointment. This was the child I'd raised to value honesty and loyalty, the young man who'd once called me his best friend and closest advisor. Watching him perform his new role with such apparent ease felt like witnessing the death of the person I'd thought he was. replaced by someone who could prioritize social advancement over family relationships without apparent conflict. The meal. Service began with the kind of elaborate presentation that turned dinner into theater. Each course arrived with detailed explanations from servers who'd been trained to make the Richardson family's menu choices sound like artistic achievements rather than simple food preparation. The wine pairings were discussed with the reverence, usually reserved for religious ceremonies, and guests were encouraged to appreciate the complexity of flavors that had been selected to complement the sophisticated palates of people who understood fine dining. I ate without tasting, my attention focused on the social dynamics playing out around me rather than the expensive cuisine that was supposed to represent the height of culinary sophistication. This was more than a wedding reception. It was a demonstration of power, a carefully orchestrated display designed to establish and reinforce social hierarchies that would govern relationships long after the celebration ended. The toasts began after the main course, another element of the evening that had been carefully scripted to highlight appropriate family members and social connections. Richard Richardson spoke first, welcoming Kevin into the family with words that sounded generous, but carried subtle implications about the improvement Kevin represented over his previous circumstances. He praised Amanda for her wisdom in choosing a husband who was clearly committed to building a successful future, code for Kevin's willingness to embrace Richardson family values and social expectations. Patricia followed with a toast that focused on Amanda's beauty and grace, her exceptional education and social accomplishments, her bright future with a husband who understood how fortunate he was to marry into such a distinguished family. Every word was calculated to reinforce the narrative that Kevin had been elevated by this marriage, that he should be grateful for the opportunity to join a family that could offer him advantages his own background couldn't provide. Kevin's toast came next, and I listened with growing dismay as my son thanked the Richardson family for welcoming him so warmly, praised Amanda for choosing him despite what he laughingly referred to as his humble beginnings, and expressed his excitement about building a life that would honor the traditions and values he was joining through marriage. Humble beginnings. The phrase hit me like a slap, reducing everything I'd sacrificed and achieved to raise him to a source of embarrassment that needed to be overcome rather than a foundation that deserved respect. Kevin was rewriting our family history to fit the Richardson narrative, erasing the woman who'd made his success possible in favor of a story that portrayed him as a self-made man who'd overcome disadvantaged circumstances through his own efforts. He never mentioned me in his toast, never acknowledged the mother who'd raised him, supported his dreams, and made countless sacrifices to ensure he had opportunities to succeed. Never recognized the family that had loved him unconditionally long before the Richardsons offered him conditional acceptance based on his willingness to conform to their social expectations. The omission was more than oversight. It was deliberate erasure. Kevin was systematically removing me from his personal narrative, transforming himself from the beloved son of a devoted mother into the ambitious young man who'd earned his place in a better family through his own merit and determination. Tyler's toast followed, and I heard him struggling to find words that would honor his brother while acknowledging the family that had raised them both. He spoke about Kevin's determination and success, his happiness with Amanda, and his excitement about the future. But he also mentioned our parents, the values they'd instilled, and the love that had sustained our family through difficult times. Kevin has always been my big brother and my role model, Tyler concluded, his voice thick with emotion. And I know our parents would be proud of the man he's become and the family he's building with Amanda. Our parents. Tyler had found a bawai, way to acknowledge our father's memory and my continued presence without directly challenging the Richardson family narrative about Kevin's humble origins. It was a diplomatic solution that honored family loyalty, while avoiding the kind of confrontation that might have disrupted the carefully orchestrated celebration. But I noticed that Kevin looked uncomfortable during Tyler's toast, his smile forced and his posture tense. My younger son's words had introduced a discordant note into the evening's symphony of social advancement, reminding everyone present that Kevin had a history and a family that existed independently of his marriage. Into Richardson prominence. The dancing began after dinner, with Kevin and Amanda performing their first dance to a song that Amanda had chosen because it had been played at her parents' wedding 30 years earlier. They moved gracefully across the polished floor, surrounded by guests who recorded every moment on their phones, creating a digital archive of the Richardson family's latest social triumph. I watched from my table as other couples joined them on the dance floor, the wedding party and immediate family members gradually expanding the circle of celebration. Patricia danced with Richard, their movements reflecting decades of practice. At social events where appearance mattered more than spontaneous joy, Amanda's grandparents swayed gently to the music, their presence adding multi-generational gravitas to the family celebration. Kevin eventually approached Patricia for the traditional mother-son dance, though she wasn't his mother. The symbolism was clear. He was dancing with the woman who represented his future rather than the one who'd shaped his past. Patricia smiled graciously as they moved across the floor, accepting his gesture as tribute to her role in orchestrating his social elevation. No one suggested that he should dance with me. No one seemed to notice that the groom's actual mother sat at a back table, watching her son honor his new family while ignoring the one that had raised him. The oversight was so complete that I wondered if Kevin even remembered I was there, or if my presence had become so peripheral to his consciousness that he could celebrate the most important day of his life without acknowledging the woman who'd made it possible. The evening continued with elaborate entertainment and celebration, but I found myself increasingly disconnected from the festivities. This wasn't my son's wedding so much as it was his initiation into a social class that had no room for the people who'd helped him reach this point. I was a witness to his transformation from Kevin Thompson, the contractor's son who'd been raised with love and modest means, into Kevin Richardson Thompson, the ambitious young man who'd married above his station and was grateful for the opportunity. As the night wore on, I realized that patience had finally reached its limits. 18 months of careful observation had taught me everything I needed to know about what my place truly was in this new family configuration. I'd been tested and found wanting, judged and found insufficient, erased and replaced by a narrative that better served everyone else's purposes. But tomorrow would bring a different kind of reckoning. Tomorrow, I would stop being the grateful widow who accepted whatever role she was assigned and start being the woman who'd been hiding in plain sight for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal what she'd been quietly building while everyone assumed she was quietly declining. The property deed in my safety deposit box would tell a very different story about humble beginnings and family hierarchies, and it was time for that story to be heard. The morning after the wedding arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after storms, emotional or otherwise. I sat in my modest kitchen at Sunset Manor, nursing coffee that had grown cold while I stared at my phone, scrolling through the dozens of social media posts that had already immortalized Kevin and Amanda's perfect day. Every angle of the Richardson family's social triumph had been captured and shared, tagged and hashtagged for maximum visibility among their carefully curated network of friends and business associates. The photos told their own story, and it wasn't one that included me. Image after image showed the Richardson family basking in their moment of glory. Kevin seamlessly integrated into their sphere of influence, Amanda radiant in her designer gown, surrounded by the people who mattered in her world. The few pictures that included Thompson family members relegated us to the background, faces partially obscured or cut off by artful cropping that emphasized the main characters while minimizing the supporting cast. I studied each photograph with the analytical attention I'd once applied to investment portfolios, noting what was included and what was deliberately omitted. Patricia Richardson appeared in dozens of shots, her emerald dress and satisfied smile communicating maternal pride and social success. Richard stood beside his daughter with the bearing of a man accustomed to being photographed at important events, his presence lending gravitas to every image he graced. Kevin looked genuinely happy in most of the photos, his smile authentic, in ways I hadn't seen since his early 20s when he'd still called me for advice about career decisions and relationship troubles. But this happiness came with a price that was becoming increasingly clear as I absorbed the visual narrative of his wedding day. He'd found joy by embracing a new identity that had no room for the woman who'd raised him or the family that had shaped his earliest understanding of love and loyalty. My phone buzzed with a text message from Janet Miller, who'd been one of my few genuine allies at the reception. "Thank you for including me yesterday. Beautiful wedding, though I couldn't help noticing some family dynamics that seemed concerning. Are you doing okay this morning?" Janet's tactful inquiry opened a door I'd been keeping carefully locked for 18 months. She'd witnessed my marginalization firsthand, had seen Kevin's systematic erasure of my role in his life, and was offering the kind of honest conversation that might require me to acknowledge truths I'd been avoiding even to myself. The temptation to unburden myself was almost overwhelming, but I wasn't ready to reveal the full scope of what I'd been hiding or planning. "Just tired," I texted back. "These big events can be emotionally draining at my age." At my age, I'd used Patricia Richardson's favorite diminishing phrase without conscious intention, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I'd internalized their narrative about my limitations so thoroughly that I was using their language to deflect genuine concern from one of the few people who still saw me as fully human, rather than a problem to be managed. The truth was that I wasn't tired from the wedding activities. I was exhausted from performing a version of myself that bore increasingly little resemblance to the woman I actually was. 3 years of playing the grateful widow, 18 months of accepting marginal roles in my son's life, and 1 day of being systematically erased from the most important celebration in Kevin's adult life had finally depleted my capacity for patience and strategic silence. I opened my laptop and began composing an email to David Chen, my financial advisor who'd been managing my public investment portfolio for the past 5 years. David was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my assets, though he didn't understand why I'd chosen to live so modestly while building such substantial wealth through careful real estate investments and market speculation. "David," I typed, "I think it's time to discuss some changes to my living situation and investment strategy. Can we schedule a meeting for this week? I'm ready to make some moves that I've been considering for quite some time." The email was deliberately vague, but David would understand that I was preparing to emerge from whatever financial hibernation had kept me in a 1-bedroom apartment while generating returns that placed me among the wealthiest residents of Maple Heights. He'd been diplomatically curious about my choices for years, though professional discretion had prevented him from questioning why someone with my resources chose to live like someone struggling on a fixed income. My next call was to Patricia Morrison, the real estate agent who'd helped me purchase several properties over the past decade through shell companies and trust arrangements that kept my name off public records. Patricia specialized in high-end, commercial and residential real estate, and she'd been instrumental in building the portfolio that Kevin and the Richardson family knew nothing about. "Margaret," Patricia's voice carried the warmth reserved for clients who generated substantial commissions without demanding excessive attention. "How lovely to hear from you. I hope you're well." "I'm very well, thank you. I'm calling because I think it might be time to consolidate some of my holdings and make a strategic move that could benefit both my family and my investment goals. Do you have time to discuss some options that might surprise people who think they know my circumstances?" Patricia had worked with enough wealthy clients to recognize the undertones in my carefully chosen words. She understood that discretion was often more valuable than ostentation, that some of her most successful clients preferred privacy to publicity when it came to their financial activities. She also knew that my quiet approach to wealth building had generated returns that exceeded those of many clients who made much more noise about their investment prowess. "Of course. When would you like to meet? I have some properties that might interest you, including one that just came on the market. That could be perfect for someone ready to make a statement about their position in the community." A statement about my position in the community. Patricia had unknowingly identified exactly what I was considering. After years of allowing people to misunderstand my circumstances, I was contemplating a revelation that would force everyone to recalculate their assumptions about Maggie Thompson and her place in the social hierarchy of Maple Heights. The property Patricia mentioned was the Willowbrook Country Club itself. The club had been struggling financially for several years, victim of changing demographics and the younger generation's different approach to social networking and business development. Membership was declining, maintenance costs were escalating, and the board of directors was quietly exploring options that might include selling to developers who would transform the prestigious venue into luxury condominiums. I'd been monitoring the situation through my network of professional contacts, waiting for the right moment to make a move that would serve both financial and personal interests. Acquiring Willowbrook would provide substantial long-term returns, while also placing me in a position of influence that would be impossible for the Richardson family or anyone else to ignore or minimize. "I'd like to schedule a meeting for tomorrow morning," I told Patricia, "and I think it's time for you to prepare a comprehensive overview of all my holdings. I have a feeling I'm going to need documentation that clearly establishes my financial position for people who may have been operating under some incorrect assumptions." After finishing my calls, I drove to the public library where I could use computers without leaving digital footprints on my personal devices. The research I needed to conduct required privacy that my home internet connection couldn't provide, particularly if I was going to investigate the Richardson family's business, dealings, and financial position with the thoroughness that strategic planning demanded. Richardson Development had built its reputation on luxury residential projects and commercial developments that served Maple Heights' most affluent residents. But public records revealed a company that had leveraged itself heavily to maintain its market position, taking on substantial debt to fund projects that were increasingly dependent on continued economic growth and consumer confidence. Richard Richardson's personal finances were more difficult to assess, but property records and business filings suggested a man who lived well while operating closer to financial margins than his lifestyle would suggest. The Lakeside Drive mansion carried a mortgage that had been refinanced several times. The country club memberships and luxury vehicles were likely financed rather than purchased outright. The Richardson family's wealth was real, but not as substantial as their social position suggested. This information was valuable for several reasons. If I decided to make my own financial position known, the Richardson family would find themselves in the awkward position of having treated someone with significantly greater resources as if she were a charity case who should be grateful for their attention. Their social calculation would be revealed as not just morally questionable, but strategically foolish. More importantly, if I acquired Willowbrook Country Club, I would become landlord to the venue where Patricia Richardson held her bridge tournaments, where Amanda had celebrated her bridal shower, where Kevin and Amanda had just celebrated the wedding that was supposed to establish their place in Maple Heights society. The irony was almost too perfect to be coincidental. I spent 3 hours at the library, compiling information about property values, business relationships, and social connections that painted a detailed picture of how power and influence operated in our small community. By the time I drove home, I had enough intelligence to make informed decisions about how to proceed with the most significant revelation of my life. The apartment felt smaller when I returned, cramped in ways that had nothing to do with its actual dimensions. The modest furniture and basic appliances that had served my disguise so well now seemed like props in a play I was no longer interested in performing. Every discount store purchase and thrift shop discovery had been calculated to support the narrative of reduced circumstances that I'd allowed Kevin and the Richardson family to believe. But maintaining that narrative was becoming increasingly difficult now that it had served its purpose. I'd learned everything I needed to know about Kevin's character and priorities. I'd tested the limits of his loyalty and found them wanting. I'd given him 18 months to demonstrate that love might matter more than social advancement, and he'd failed that test repeatedly and definitively. The wedding had been the final examination, and Kevin had chosen his new family over the one that had raised him with a clarity that eliminated any remaining ambiguity about where his loyalties lay. There was no point in continuing to hope that he might remember who he used to be, or rediscover the values I'd tried to instill during the 32 years before Amanda Richardson entered his life. My phone rang, interrupting contemplations that were growing increasingly difficult to contain within the bounds of strategic patience. Tyler's name appeared on the screen, bringing with it the complex emotions that my younger son always evoked. Unlike Kevin, Tyler had never forgotten where he came from or who had made his opportunities possible. But he'd also been careful not to challenge Kevin's choices directly, walking a diplomatic line that protected his own family while avoiding confrontations that might fracture our already strained relationships. "Mom," Tyler's voice carried concern that he was trying to keep casual. "I wanted to check on you after yesterday. That was a lot to process, and I know some of the family dynamics were pretty intense." Pretty intense was a charitable description of what had transpired at Kevin's wedding. Systematic marginalization might be more accurate, or deliberate erasure, or public humiliation disguised as social propriety. But Tyler was offering emotional support in the careful way that children learned when they wanted to help but couldn't. Risk alienating siblings who held grudges and made family gatherings uncomfortable for everyone. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew that fine was a complicated word that could mean anything from genuine contentment to barely controlled rage. It was Kevin's day, and I wanted him to be happy. "Mom, you know I love Kevin, but some of the things he did yesterday, the way he acted toward you, that wasn't okay. Sarah and I talked about it last night, and we both felt like he crossed some lines that shouldn't have been crossed, regardless of what the Richardson family expected." Tyler's acknowledgement of Kevin's behavior validated feelings I'd been carefully containing for months. My younger son had witnessed the systematic disrespect and recognized it for what it was, even if he couldn't directly confront his brother about choices that had transformed Kevin into someone none of us fully recognized. "What bothers me most," Tyler continued, "is that he seems to have forgotten everything you did for us growing up. The sacrifices you made, the opportunities you provided, the way you supported our dreams even when it meant going without things you wanted. Yesterday it was like none of that history mattered to him anymore." Tyler's words cut deeper than Kevin's neglect, because they came from someone who still remembered and valued our family's authentic history. My younger son understood that Kevin's success hadn't materialized from nothing, that the opportunities he'd been able to pursue had been funded by careful financial planning and strategic sacrifices that his mother had made without complaint or expectation of gratitude. "People change," I said carefully, though I was beginning to think that Kevin hadn't changed so much as revealed who he'd always been underneath the surface affection and filial duty that had masked his true priorities. Marriage is a big transition. Maybe he just needs time to find his balance between his old life and his new one. "Maybe," Tyler said, though his tone suggested he was no more convinced by that explanation than I was. "But I want you to know that Sarah and I see what's happening, and we don't think it's right. If you ever need anything, if you ever want to talk about family stuff that's getting complicated, we're here for you." After Tyler hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the modest furnishings that had supported my disguise for 3 years, contemplating the choice that was crystallizing with increasing clarity. I could continue playing the role of marginalized widow, accepting whatever scraps of attention Kevin was willing to offer while watching him build a life that had no meaningful place for the woman who'd made it possible. Or I could stop pretending, to be less than I was and start being exactly who I'd always been underneath the costume I'd worn for other people's comfort. The choice was mine, had always been mine, and I was finally ready to make it with full awareness of what it would cost and what it might accomplish. The safety deposit box downtown contained more than property deeds and investment records. It held the complete documentation of a life lived with purpose and strategic intelligence. evidence of capabilities that extended far beyond what Kevin or the Richardson family had bothered to discover about the woman they'd dismissed as an aging burden who should be grateful for whatever attention she received. Margaret Thompson, the modest widow from Sunset Manor Apartments, was about to retire from public performance. What would emerge in her place was someone who'd been building power and influence, while everyone assumed she was building nothing more than a quiet retirement funded by Social Security and whatever modest inheritance her husband had left behind. The transformation would shock people who thought they knew me, disappoint people who'd been comfortable with my diminished status, and force recalculations that might restore respect or create entirely new forms of conflict. But it would also restore my authentic place in the world, the position I'd earned through decades of careful planning and strategic investment, rather than the position I'd been assigned by people who'd never bothered to look beneath the surface. Tomorrow I would begin the process of revelation that would either rebuild my relationship with Kevin on more honest foundations or make clear that such rebuilding was impossible. Either outcome was preferable to continuing the current arrangement, where I accepted marginalization in exchange for minimal inclusion in a family structure that treated me as peripheral to my own son's life. The wedding was over, but the real celebration was about to begin. And this time, I would be occupying the center of attention rather than watching from the margins as other people took credit for accomplishments that had been possible only because of foundations I'd laid long before anyone thought to question who had actually built the prosperity they were all enjoying. The Willowbrook Country Club boardroom smelled of leather and old money, though both scents were more aspirational than authentic given the club's deteriorating financial position. I sat at the mahogany conference table that Patricia Richardson had probably polished with her social ambitions for decades, listening to the club's president explain why they were considering my acquisition offer with the kind of desperate gratitude that poorly disguised their relief at finding a buyer who could meet their asking price without requiring extensive negotiations. David Chen sat beside me with a briefcase full of documentation that would have shocked anyone who thought they knew my financial capabilities. Bank statements showing liquid assets that exceeded the gross domestic product of small nations. Investment portfolios that had been generating returns while I clipped grocery store coupons for dramatic effect. Real estate holdings scattered across 3 states, all purchased through shell companies that had kept my name off public records while building. Wealth that dwarfed anything the Richardson family had achieved through 3 generations of development projects. Mrs. Thompson, said Harold Whitman, the club's president, who'd probably never imagined that the modest widow he'd politely ignored at social gatherings could be sitting across from him as a potential owner. Your offer is certainly generous, and your financial qualifications are clearly substantial. May I ask what your plans would be for Willowbrook if the board approves this transaction? Such a diplomatic way of asking whether I intended to maintain the club's exclusive character or transform it into something that might threaten the social hierarchy that members like the Richardson family had spent decades cultivating. Harold's nervousness was palpable as he contemplated the possibility that someone he'd dismissed as socially irrelevant might soon control the venue where his wife hosted her charity luncheons, and his business associates negotiated deals over expensive whiskey. I believe Willowbrook has tremendous potential that hasn't been fully realized, I replied, choosing words that could mean anything while committing to nothing specific. The facilities are excellent, the location is prime, and the membership represents exactly the kind of community leadership that makes ventures like this successful. I see no reason to make dramatic changes to something that already functions. Well? David suppressed what might have been a smile at my diplomatic non-answer. He'd worked with enough wealthy clients to recognize the careful language that successful people used when they wanted to reassure anxious parties without limiting their future options. My response told the board that I wasn't planning to turn their exclusive club into a public golf course, but it also left considerable room for interpretations that might surprise them once the transaction was completed. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises to expedite the approval process, though I suspected the real discussions would begin once I left the room. Harold and his fellow board members would spend the afternoon trying to understand How they'd so completely misjudged the financial resources of someone they'd been casually dismissing at social events for years. The cognitive dissonance alone would be worth the purchase price. As David and I walked through the club's lobby toward the parking area, I caught sight of Patricia Richardson entering the building with several other women who were probably arriving for their weekly bridge tournament. She nodded politely when she saw me, her expression carrying the same condescending friendliness she'd displayed since Kevin's engagement announcement, the kind of acknowledgement that communicated her awareness of my presence without suggesting any particular interest in my activities or opinions. "Good afternoon, Margaret," Patricia said, her voice projecting across the marble-floored lobby with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her right to occupy such spaces. "How nice to see you here. Are you meeting someone for lunch?" The assumption that I must be someone's guest rather than a member or potential owner revealed everything about how Patricia had categorized me in her mental hierarchy. I was the kind of person who might be invited to Willowbrook by someone more established, but certainly not someone who would have independent reasons for being there, or independent resources that might grant access to exclusive venues. "Just finishing up some business," I replied pleasantly, gesturing toward David in his expensive suit with his leather briefcase that suggested significant financial transactions rather than social visiting. "I hope you enjoy your bridge game." Patricia's eyes flicked toward David with the kind of calculating assessment that successful social climbers employed when encountering unfamiliar variables in familiar environments. She was trying to place him in her mental catalog of Maple Heights' professional hierarchy, probably wondering what kind of business someone like me might have with someone who looked like serious money. "Well," she said after a moment's pause, "I'm sure Kevin and Amanda appreciated having you at the wedding. It meant so much to them to have family there to witness their special day." Family there to witness. Another carefully chosen phrase that managed to acknowledge my biological relationship to Kevin, while minimizing my importance in the celebration that had supposedly honored the joining of two families. Patricia had reduced my role to that of witness rather than participant, someone whose presence had been noted, but whose absence wouldn't have significantly diminished the occasion. It was beautiful, I agreed, though we both knew that beauty could encompass events that were simultaneously elegant and cruel, perfect in their execution and devastating in their implications. Amanda looked radiant, and the club provided such an elegant setting for their celebration. As we walked toward our cars, David finally spoke the question I could see he'd been containing throughout our interaction with Patricia Richardson. "That was the mother of the bride from your son's wedding, wasn't it? The one who planned the seating arrangements that put you at the back table?" David had attended the wedding as my guest, one of the few people present who understood the financial reality behind my modest appearance and peripheral placement in the celebration. He'd watched the Richardson family's social theater with the analytical attention of someone who worked regularly with wealthy clients and understood the difference between authentic prosperity and performed status. "That's Patricia," I confirmed, settling into the passenger seat of David's Mercedes while Patricia walked toward the club entrance with her bridge partners, still radiating the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her position in the local social hierarchy. "And she has no idea that you could buy her husband's development company with pocket change?" David asked, starting the engine with the kind of smooth power that comes from German engineering and maintenance budgets that most people couldn't afford. "None whatsoever," I said, watching through the window as Patricia disappeared into the building that might soon belong to me. Which makes today's transaction particularly satisfying from a strategic perspective. David navigated toward downtown Maple Heights, where we'd scheduled lunch at Romano's, an upscale restaurant that I'd been avoiding for 3 years because Kevin or Amanda might see me there and wonder how I could afford meals that cost more than my supposed weekly grocery budget. Today, however, concealment was no longer necessary or desirable. I was ready to be seen occupying spaces that reflected my actual resources, rather than continuing to perform poverty for people who'd used my fictional limitations to justify their treatment of me. The restaurant buzzed with the kind of midday energy that came from business lunches and professional networking. Conversations about deals and developments that shaped the economic landscape of our small community. I recognized several faces from Kevin's wedding, people who'd smiled politely when introduced to the groom's mother, but clearly hadn't considered me worth remembering or cultivating as a potential connection. Dr. Harrison sat at a corner table with two other men who were probably colleagues from the hospital, their discussion intense enough to suggest they were addressing serious professional matters rather than engaging in social conversation. He glanced up when David and I were seated at a nearby table, his expression showing the kind of mild confusion that people experienced when they encountered familiar faces in unexpected contexts. Why would Kevin's elderly mother be having lunch at Romano's with someone who obviously represented serious money? The question was written across Dr. Harrison's features as he tried to reconcile his assumptions about my circumstances with the evidence of my current activities. His confusion would multiply exponentially when news of the Willowbrook acquisition became public knowledge. "Margaret," David said after we'd ordered wine that cost more per glass than most people spent on entire bottles, "I have to ask about your timeline for revealing your actual situation to your family. The property acquisition will be public record within a few weeks, and I suspect that's going to generate questions that you'll need to be prepared to answer." Timeline for revelation. David had identified the crucial decision that I'd been postponing while gathering intelligence and positioning assets for maximum strategic impact. How long could I continue playing the role of modest widow while simultaneously acquiring properties and making investment moves that would inevitably expose the scope of my actual resources? "I think the time for gradual revelation has passed," I said, tasting wine that represented a month's rent at Sunset Manor while contemplating the end of my 3-year performance as someone who needed to consider such expenses carefully. Kevin's wedding showed me everything I needed to know about how my family really sees me and what they actually value in relationships. David nodded with the understanding of someone who'd watched wealthy clients navigate family dynamics that were complicated by money and the assumptions that people made about inheritance and financial dependency. He'd seen enough family drama to recognize the signs of relationships that had been poisoned by incorrect assumptions and social pressures that revealed character in ways that ordinary circumstances never could. Have you considered how Kevin might react when he learns that you've been, shall we say, managing your public image for strategic purposes? David asked delicately. Some people find it difficult to acknowledge that they've misjudged situations so completely, especially when their misjudgments have led them to behave in ways they might later regret. Kevin's potential reaction was something I'd been contemplating since the morning after his wedding, when the full scope of his transformation had become impossible to ignore or rationalize. My older son had systematically erased me from his life narrative, chosen social advancement over family loyalty, and demonstrated that his love was conditional on my willingness to remain invisible and grateful for whatever attention he was willing to provide. Kevin made his choices based on what he thought he knew about my circumstances and what he decided those circumstances meant about my value as a person, I said, cutting into lamb that had been prepared with the kind of culinary expertise that I could afford to enjoy but had been avoiding for the sake of maintaining my disguise. If he's uncomfortable when he learns that his assumptions were incorrect, that discomfort might be exactly what he needs to experience. The conversation continued through multiple courses and expensive wine, though we both understood that we were discussing more than financial strategy or family dynamics. This was about power and respect, about the difference between being valued for who you were versus being managed because of who people assumed you were. It was about the price of hiding your light under other people's expectations and the cost of revealing capabilities that challenged comfortable assumptions about social hierarchies and family relationships. By the time we finished lunch, I'd made the decision that had been building for months. Next week would bring the Willowbrook acquisition announcement, followed shortly by strategic revelations that would force everyone who thought they knew Margaret Thompson to recalculate their understanding of who she actually was and what she was capable of achieving. David drove me back to Sunset Manor, though the modest apartment complex felt increasingly surreal as a residence for someone who'd just committed to purchasing one of Maple Heights' most prestigious properties. The contrast between my public housing and my private resources was becoming too dramatic to maintain, especially now that I was ready to stop performing for audiences who'd failed to appreciate the show. My phone buzzed with a text message from Kevin as I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment. "Mom, Amanda and I are having dinner with her parents tonight to discuss some wedding thank-you logistics. Can we call you tomorrow to catch up about how everything went?" Tomorrow to catch up. 24 hours after his wedding, Kevin was ready to spare time for a conversation with the mother who'd raised him, though even that communication would be scheduled around social obligations that clearly took priority over family relationships. The text message captured everything about how I'd been positioned in his life since Amanda entered the picture. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I unlocked my apartment door and surveyed the modest space that had served my purposes for 3 years, but would soon become as obsolete as the performance it had been designed to support. Tomorrow would bring conversations that might repair our relationship, or confirm that it had been damaged beyond redemption. But either outcome would be based on truth rather than the carefully maintained fiction that had governed our interactions since his engagement. The safety deposit box key sat in my jewelry case beside pieces that were worth more than most people's annual salaries, though I'd been wearing discount store accessories to maintain my disguise. Tomorrow, I would retrieve documents that would either shock Kevin into understanding what he'd lost, or provide legal protection if his reaction proved hostile rather than remorseful. Either way, the performance was ending. Margaret Thompson was about to step out of the shadows where she'd been hiding and claim her rightful place in a world that had forgotten who she really was underneath the costume she'd been wearing for other people's comfort. The phone rang again, this time displaying Tyler's number with timing that suggested he might have inherited more of his mother's intuitive abilities than Kevin had ever demonstrated. My younger son had always been more perceptive about emotional undercurrents and family dynamics, more willing to acknowledge complexity rather than accepting surface explanations for behaviors that didn't make complete sense. "Mom?" Tyler's voice carried the warmth that had been absent from Kevin's text message, the genuine affection that suggested he still saw me as a person rather than a problem to be managed around more important priorities. I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. Sarah and I have been talking, and we think there are some things about the wedding and Kevin's behavior that need to be addressed directly. Tyler's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths represented everything that Kevin had abandoned in his pursuit of social advancement and Richardson family approval. My younger son was ready to have difficult conversations about family loyalty and respect, even if those conversations might create conflict with his brother or complicate relationships that everyone else preferred to keep superficially harmonious. "What kinds of things?" I asked, though I suspected Tyler had identified the same patterns of disrespect and marginalization that had been building throughout Kevin's engagement and reached their culmination during the wedding celebration. The way he talked about humble beginnings in his toast, like he was embarrassed by where he came from instead of grateful for the opportunities you provided. The way he positioned you at the back of the reception, like you were some distant relative instead of his mother. The way he danced with Patricia Richardson but never asked you to dance, never acknowledged you in any of the formal moments that were supposed to honor family. Tyler had been paying attention to details that Kevin had hoped would go unnoticed, cataloging behaviors that revealed character in ways that formal speeches and public performances never could. My younger son understood that weddings were theaters where people's true priorities became visible through their choices about inclusion and acknowledgement, respect and marginalization. Most of all, Tyler continued, the way he's been treating you like you're financially dependent on his goodwill, like you need his guidance and management instead of his appreciation and respect. "Mom, I know Dad left you comfortable, and I know you're more capable than Kevin gives you credit for. But sometimes I wonder if there are things about your situation that none of us fully understand." Tyler's intuition was leading him toward questions that would be answered sooner than he expected, though I wasn't ready to provide those answers during a phone conversation that might be overheard or misunderstood. The revelation I was planning required careful staging and complete documentation, particularly if Kevin's reaction proved defensive or hostile rather than appropriately ashamed. "There are always things about people's lives that others don't fully understand," I said carefully. "But I appreciate your concern, and I'm grateful that you still see me as someone who deserves respect rather than management." "You deserve a lot more than respect," Tyler said firmly. "You deserve recognition for everything you've done for this family, and you deserve to be treated like the important person you are instead of being pushed to the sidelines so Kevin can impress his new in-laws." After Tyler hung up, I sat in my living room contemplating the dramatic changes that the next week would bring to relationships that had been built on false assumptions and maintained through careful performance. The modest apartment that had served my disguise would soon be replaced by housing that reflected my actual resources. The discount store wardrobe would give way to clothing that honored rather than concealed my accomplishments. The role of grateful widow would be retired, in favor of the authentic identity I'd been hiding for 3 years. Most importantly, the family dynamics that had positioned me as peripheral to my own son's life would be recalibrated by information that would force everyone to choose between acknowledging their mistakes or defending positions that would be revealed as indefensible once the truth was known. The wedding was over, but the real celebration was about to begin. And this time, I would be at the center of attention, rather than watching from the margins as other people claimed credit for accomplishments that had been built on foundations they'd never bothered to examine or acknowledge. The call from Kevin came exactly 24 hours after his wedding, punctual in the way that business appointments were punctual rather than family conversations. I let it ring twice before answering, gathering my thoughts for what I suspected would be our last conversation as mother and son who maintained polite fictions about our relationship dynamics. "Hi, Mom." Kevin's voice carried the cheerful efficiency of someone checking an item off his post-wedding to-do list. "Sorry I couldn't call yesterday, but you know how crazy these things get. Amanda and I are finally getting caught up on everything." Getting caught up on everything. I wondered if that included reflecting on how he'd treated his mother during the most important celebration of his adult life, or if his focus was entirely on thank you notes and honeymoon planning and the social obligations that would cement his position in the Richardson family hierarchy. "The wedding was beautiful," I said, settling into my armchair with the kind of calm that comes from having finally made irreversible decisions. "You and Amanda looked very happy." "We are happy," Kevin replied, though something in his tone suggested he was waiting for me to express appropriate gratitude for being included in their celebration, however peripherally, and we appreciated having family there to share the moment with us. Family there to share the moment. The same phrase Patricia Richardson had used, reducing my role from central participant to grateful observer. Kevin had fully absorbed the Richardson narrative about family hierarchies and appropriate expectations, though he seemed unaware that his language revealed how completely he'd internalized their assessment of my value and position. "Kevin," I said, my voice carrying a weight that made him pause in whatever he'd been planning to say next. "I need to tell you something important, and I need you to listen carefully without interrupting." The silence that followed was different from ordinary conversational pauses. It carried the tension that emerges when people sense that familiar dynamics are about to shift in ways they can't control or predict. Kevin was probably calculating whether this was going to be an emotional conversation about hurt feelings that he'd need to manage diplomatically, or something else entirely. "Okay," he said carefully. "What's going on?" "For the past 3 years, ever since your father died, I've been living a lie," I began, each word chosen with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this revelation many times, but was finally ready to deliver it. Not because I intended to deceive anyone, but because I wanted to discover who you really were when you thought I needed your help, versus who you were when you knew I didn't. Mom, I don't understand what you're talking about. I'm talking about the modest apartment, and the discount clothing, and the grocery store coupons, and all the other evidence of financial limitation that convinced you I needed to be managed, and guided and marginalized for my own good. My voice remained steady, despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. I'm talking about the fact that everything you think you know about my circumstances has been carefully constructed to test. Whether you loved me for who I was, or whether you only respected me when you thought I could benefit you somehow. The silence stretched longer this time, filled with Kevin's attempts to process information that challenged every assumption he'd made about our relationship since his father's death. I could almost hear him reviewing conversations and decisions and family dynamics through the lens of what I was telling him. "What are you saying?" he asked finally, his voice smaller than it had been moments earlier. "I'm saying that the house I sold wasn't sold out of necessity. I'm saying that the apartment I moved to wasn't the best I could afford. I'm saying that the woman you've been treating like a charity case for 18 months is actually wealthier than the Richardson family you've been so eager to impress." The words hit their target with the precision I'd intended. Kevin's sharp intake of breath confirmed that he was beginning to understand the scope of his miscalculation, though I suspected he hadn't yet grasped the full implications of what his treatment of me revealed about his character and priorities. "That's impossible," he said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself rather than me. "Mom, if you had money, real money, you wouldn't be living in that apartment, driving that old car, shopping at discount stores. Unless I was conducting an experiment to see how my children would treat me when they thought I was vulnerable, versus how they'd treat me when they knew I had power," I replied calmly. "Unless I wanted to learn whether your love was conditional on my usefulness, or whether it was based on something more fundamental and enduring." The revelation was unfolding exactly as I'd planned it, each piece of information building on the Bob's previous disclosure to create a complete picture of Kevin's failure as a son and my success as a strategist. But I wasn't finished yet. The most dramatic elements were still to come. "Kevin, do you remember telling me to know my place at your wedding?" "I didn't mean anything by that," he said quickly, probably remembering the velvet rope incident, and realizing that his casual dismissal had been witnessed and remembered. "I was just stressed about everything going smoothly." "You were stressed about me embarrassing you in front of your new family," I corrected. "You were worried that your mother might somehow diminish your social standing or interfere with the image you were trying to project. You told me to know my place because you'd decided that my place was wherever it wouldn't inconvenience your ambitions." "Mom, that's not fair. The wedding was complicated, and Amanda's parents had specific expectations about how things should be handled." "Amanda's parents had expectations about how people like me should be handled," I said, allowing steel to enter my voice for the first time. People they assumed were financially dependent and socially inferior. People who should be grateful for whatever inclusion they received and shouldn't expect to be treated as equals. Kevin's breathing had changed, becoming shallow in the way that happens when people realize they're in conversations that might reshape their understanding of reality in permanently uncomfortable ways. He was beginning to comprehend that this wasn't going to be the manageable discussion about hurt feelings that he'd probably been expecting. "Well, Kevin, I have something to tell you about my place," I continued, reaching for the folder of documents that David Chen had prepared for exactly this moment. "My place, as it turns out, is on the property deed for Willowbrook Country Club, which I purchased yesterday afternoon." The silence that followed was absolute. No breathing, no background noise, no indication that Kevin was still connected to the call except for the digital display showing that the line remained active. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you just say?" "I said that I bought Willowbrook Country Club, the venue where you celebrated your wedding, where Patricia Richardson holds her bridge tournaments, where Amanda had her bridal shower. I own it now, Kevin. I own the place where you told me to know my place. That's impossible, Kevin repeated, though with less conviction than before. Mom, Willowbrook costs millions of dollars. You can't just buy a country club. You're right that it costs millions of dollars, I agreed pleasantly. $12.5 million to be exact, which represents about 18% of my liquid assets, not counting real estate holdings, investment portfolios, or the art collection that I've been building for the past 15 years. I could hear Kevin's world reshaping itself around information that invalidated 3 years of assumptions about our family dynamics and his position within them. The grateful widow who'd needed his guidance was revealed as someone who'd been testing his character while building wealth that dwarfed anything he'd achieved or inherited through marriage. I don't understand, he said, though I suspected he was beginning to understand more than he wanted to acknowledge. If you have all this money, why did you let me think you were struggling? Why did you move to that apartment? Why did you act like you needed help with everything? Because I wanted to know who you really were, I said simply. I wanted to discover whether you'd love me when you thought I was weak, or only when you knew I was strong. Whether you'd respect me when you thought I needed your help, or only when you realized I'd never needed anything from you except the loyalty and affection that should have been automatic between a mother and son. The test results, I didn't need to tell him, had been definitive. Kevin had failed spectacularly, choosing social advancement over family loyalty, allowing his mother to be marginalized and disrespected because he thought she lacked the power to demand better treatment. Kevin, I said when his silence stretched beyond what conversational timing could accommodate. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Do you comprehend that everything you think you've gained through your marriage to Amanda is insignificant compared to what you've lost through your treatment of me? Mom, I need to come over. We need to talk about this in person. No, I said firmly. We needed to talk in person 18 months ago, when you started treating me like a burden instead of your mother. We needed to talk in person 6 months ago, when you began letting Patricia Richardson make decisions about my role in your wedding. We needed to talk in person yesterday, when you told me to know my place at your own wedding reception. Kevin's attempts to speak were cut off by the weight of my continued revelation. He was learning that patience had limits, that love could be tested beyond its breaking point, and that assumptions about power and vulnerability could be catastrophically wrong when they were based on appearances rather than investigation. The woman you've been managing for the past 3 years owns properties in 4 states, I continued relentlessly. She's funded scholarships that have changed dozens of lives, supported medical research that's saving lives, and built wealth that will continue growing long after everyone who underestimated her is forgotten. The woman you seated at the back table of your wedding reception could buy and sell the Richardson Development Company with pocket change. Mom, please, let me explain. Explain what, Kevin? Explain how you forgot that I raised you alone after your father died, that I paid for your education, that I supported your dreams when you were too young to pursue them independently. Explain how you decided that marrying into money was more important than honoring the woman who made your success possible. The questions hung in the air like accusations, which was exactly what they were meant to be. I'd given Kevin 3 years to demonstrate his character, and he'd shown me exactly who he was when he thought his choices carried no consequences for him personally. I can't undo what happened at the wedding, Kevin said finally, his voice thick with something that might have been tears or might have been panic as he realized the scope of his miscalculation. But I can try to make it right. I can talk to Amanda, explain to her parents, make sure everyone understands how much you mean to our family. Kevin, I said gently, do you think this is about Amanda or her parents? Do you think Patricia Richardson forced you to treat me badly? Or do you think she simply gave you permission to act on priorities that were already governing your choices? The question struck home with the accuracy I'd intended. Kevin's treatment of me hadn't been imposed by his new family. It had been enabled by them. The Richardsons' social expectations had provided convenient justification for behavior that reflected his authentic values and priorities. "I want you to think about something," I continued. "When you told me to know my place at your wedding, you revealed everything about what you actually think of me. Not what you think you should think, not what you tell yourself you think, but what you actually believe about my value and importance in your life." "That's not fair," Kevin said, though his protest lacked conviction. "You don't understand the pressure I was under, the expectations I had to meet. I understand that you had a choice between honoring your mother and impressing your new in-laws," I replied. "I understand that you chose impressing people you'd known for 2 years over respecting the woman who'd loved you for 32 years. That choice tells me everything I need to know about who you've become." The conversation was approaching its natural conclusion, though I suspected Kevin was hoping for some indication that forgiveness was possible, that our relationship could be repaired if he said the right words or made the appropriate gestures. But some damage was too fundamental to be fixed with apologies, some revelations of character too definitive to be explained away with excuses about stress and social pressure. "Mom," Kevin said desperately, "what do you want me to do? How can I fix this?" "You can't fix it," I said simply. "You can't undo 3 years of treating me like I was less important than your career prospects. You can't erase 18 months of letting your fiancé's family marginalize me because you thought I lacked the power to object. You can't take back telling me to know my place at your own wedding. So that's it? You're going to cut me out of your life because I made some mistakes during a stressful time?" "I'm not cutting you out of anything, Kevin. You removed yourself from my life when you decided that your mother was an embarrassment to be managed rather than a person to be honored. I'm simply acknowledging what you've already chosen." The silence that followed was different from earlier pauses in our conversation. This was the silence of someone realizing that certain actions have permanent consequences, that some bridges burn completely when they're tested beyond their structural capacity. If you ever decide that you want a relationship with your mother based on who she actually is, rather than who you needed her to be for your social convenience, I said, you know where to find me. But it will have to be a relationship between equals, Kevin. I'm done being anyone's charity case or social liability. I ended the call before Kevin could formulate a response, though I suspected that anything he might have said would have been insufficient to address the magnitude of what he'd learned and lost. The revelation was complete. The test results were final, and the relationship dynamics that had governed our family for 3 years were permanently altered. My phone immediately began ringing again, Kevin's name appearing on the display with the persistence of someone who believed that continued conversation might somehow change what had already been established. I let it ring until voicemail engaged, then powered off the device entirely. Some conversations were complete, whether all parties wanted them to be or not. The transformation from Margaret Thompson, modest widow, to Margaret Thompson, property owner and philanthropist, was now public knowledge within my family. Soon it would become public knowledge throughout Maple Heights, as news of the Willowbrook acquisition spread through social networks that thrived on surprising revelations about people they thought they understood. Patricia Richardson would learn that the woman she'd condescended to at bridge tournaments was now her landlord. Amanda would discover that her dismissive treatment of her new mother-in-law had been directed towards someone who could have bought her parents' business without, affecting her monthly budget. The entire Richardson family social network would need to recalculate their understanding of hierarchies and relationships, and the dangerous assumptions that could be made about people who chose to live quietly rather than ostentatiously. Most importantly, Kevin would have to live with the knowledge that his transformation from loving son to social climber had been witnessed, documented, and judged by the woman who knew him better than anyone else in the world. He would have to accept that some tests, once failed, couldn't be retaken with better preparation or different circumstances. The apartment at Sunset Manor felt smaller than ever as I contemplated the changes that would follow my revelation. But the smallness was temporary now. A costume that had served its purpose and could finally be discarded in favor of housing that honored, rather than concealed, my accomplishments and resources. Tomorrow I would begin the process of reclaiming my authentic place in the world, surrounded by people who valued my capabilities, rather than managing my limitations. The performance was over, the test was complete, and the results would echo through my family's understanding of themselves for years to come. Kevin had told me to know my place at his wedding. Now he would spend the rest of his life knowing exactly what that place was, and exactly what he'd sacrificed when he chose social advancement over the love that had made his success possible in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.